All right, away we go. All right, so today's question is, how do I cope with gospel inconsistencies? And as usual, I start, planning these things and think, oh gosh, how am I going to fill a whole hour on this topic? And then I end up with more than I can possibly say in an hour and a half. So I will try to talk fast and get everybody to bed at a reasonable hour. At least it's snowy and nobody has anywhere to be right now, right? So assumptions. The first place that I want to start when I am asked a question about gospel inconsistencies is with the genre of the gospels. Um, what is the intended genre? What is the author wanting us to understand as we start to read this? And there are several possibilities as far as I can ascertain. The first possibility is that the genre of a gospel is a biography, or another word that is kind of thrown around from this contemporary period in the turn of the, what do we call that? The turn of the BCs to 80s, in that ancient Roman period, is eritology. And eritology is the study of mighty deeds. So in the way that biography is a writing about a life, bio, right? And eritology is a writing about the mighty deeds that have been done by a god or by someone who has godlike status, like a Caesar kind of figure. And so kind of a sacred biography. And Mark 1, verse 1 is kind of the title of Mark's gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So this is a typical kind of way that one of these eritologies would be titled. The good news of Caesar Augustus, the Son of God. It would have been something that you would not have been surprised to see in a writing. So these sacred biographies narrated the mighty deeds, the life of one of these gods or heroes, but it wasn't just for the purpose of knowing something about this person. It was for a rhetorical reason. It was most of the time the rhetorical reason was to convince people who were reading it or listening to it that they should follow the particular moral philosophy or kind of way of life expressed in the narrative, the virtues of the subject. So it's not just mighty deeds in terms of supernatural powers. It's mighty deeds in terms of expressing their virtues. So if you think of something like Hercules and all of the deeds that he did, were not just to ooh and awe over the fact that he was able to kill all of these famous monsters. We are also supposed to learn, dignity and humility and caring for our fellow man, things like that, from the story. And so that is the purpose of an eritology. So perhaps the Gospels are this. They are an attempt to use the life of an important person to shape the morality of the hearer or listener. Biographies also were common in the ancient world. And they were also used to teach morality. I think the difference between a biography and an eritology would mostly be to do with the godlike status of the subject. But biographies also tended to focus on the death of the person whose life is being used to teach morality. There's this focus on a quote, good death. that matches the virtuous life of the person that is being described. And Mark actually kind of turns this this pattern on its head, because Jesus, of course, does not have a good death. Jesus has a very bad death. But Mark kind of takes this conceit, and in the context of the virtuous life that Jesus lived, his bad death actually gives additional meaning to his story, and to to the morality of the tale, in terms of the listener or reader interacting with it. And this is not a completely unknown thing. Thinking about one of the most famous of these biographies with a bad death, quote unquote, is Socrates, the death of Socrates, when Socrates was forced to drink poison because he was condemned. That's the same kind of thing. That the idea being that Socrates is a good guy, and he unfortunately was hanging out with the wrong type of people in his generation, and so they didn't accept what he was saying, even though everyone knows that he was right. And so he ended up dying in a bad way, which kind of underlines his morality, his superiority in terms of who he is and his virtue. So Jesus kind of follows along with that. So you can see, this is a pretty good, solid way to potentially give the Gospels a genre. But there are other options. If we think about what if it's a history, a book of that is attempting to give us just an account of what what has happened in the life of this person. And we have some evidence for that too. The introduction to Luke, as Luke is telling us why he's writing, Luke 1 verses 1-4 says, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." So that's a lot of words, but basically what Luke is saying is, I investigated this situation and I am giving you an orderly count of the events, so that, why, you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So pretty much a history, right? Go and find out the facts and write them down chronologically so that we can see what happened and know the truth about them. Now, what exactly he means by the truth is a whole different conversation that we could have at some point. But we could, kind of take history as a possible genre here. But that's not all. There are other possibilities as well. What about theology or evangelism? The Gospel of John doesn't have an introduction so much, but it does have a conclusion that gives us some sense of what the purpose of the writing was. It says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these signs and stories are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." So John is pretty explicit here that the reason for his writing is so that the people who read or hear may believe that they have life in his name because he is the Messiah, the Son of God. So the idea that that the Gospels genre could have something to do with theology is, I think, legitimate. But this is also not completely unique. But where we want to go with this actually isn't into the context of the Greco-Roman world in which these Gospels were written. We actually want to go to a closer cultural context, which is the Jewish world. thinking about how do these gospels not only fit into their wider cultural milieu in the Greco-Roman world, but into the narrower milieu of Israel at the time, of the Jewish people. And so thinking about, how do these gospels fit with the scriptures of the Jews, fit with what we call the Old Testament? And so what has become most compelling to me when you think about the genre of a gospel is the concept of the biographical covenantal theology, which is a lot of big, heavy words. But what people who talk about this and kind of think about this are suggesting is that we should compare the gospels not to these biographies of people like Caesar or Socrates, um, not to the histories that were written by Josephus, but to the books of the Old Testament, especially to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is similar to the gospels in terms of its narrative structure and in terms of how intense it is in sharing its theology. It's very obvious in the book of in the book of Exodus that we're not just telling a nice story. There is deep meaning to this story, and there is intensity. There is a sense of urgency that we not only tell the story but express what the story means in the telling. And the gospels kind of share that idea. And so the idea that um, the gospels and the book of Exodus share that they are about the life of a mediator of God's covenant, that they share the story of how that covenant was established between God and the people, and the mediator delivers a new law or a new interpretation of the law. These are things that are shared between Exodus and the Gospels. And so if we think about this as about the covenant, the life of the covenant maker, mediator, not maker because God's the maker, the person who mediates the covenant and the life that they lived, then talking about how the covenant was established, and then talking about how that covenant is expanded in terms of the law and in terms of how we should respond to that covenant. Those patterns can be seen between both Exodus and the Gospels. And so a biographical covenantal theology book is the genre of the Gospels according to these people. And when we think about that, we have to think about the difference for if we're going in that direction. What is the difference if the genre of the Gospels is this focus on the covenant? Well, we can use and manipulate events and stories as we receive them about Jesus for making a theological point. We don't have to stick to that historical accuracy because that is less important than the theological and literary interpretation that people can gain by reading the story as it's laid out in its particular order. And it's really helpful. It's a really interesting and helpful frame to use because it helps us even to see how the Bible came to be. When we think about the types of stories in our Bible from Old Testament all the way to from Genesis all the way to Revelation, if there are books that are written as histories, written as narrative, those are the stories of God's covenantal relationship with the people that God has chosen. Books that are based on the law are there because they show the law as as the content of the covenant, as kind of God's expectations for covenant people. Wisdom literature, the poetry books, provide guidance about how to live in the reality of the covenant that God has made with us. Prophecy books and letters, the epistles, remind the reader or hearer of those messages of the promises that they have made in that covenant, the promises that God has made in the covenant, and the ways in which we have violated that covenant that we made with God. And it also helps us to see why certain books are included in the Bible and why some aren't. There are lots and lots of gospels out there. The Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. We have this for a while there. Maybe a decade or so ago, the Gospel of Judas was running around, and people were freaking out about that. Why aren't those in the Bible? Well, it's not a gospel if it doesn't fit into this idea about biographical covenantal theology. If it doesn't speak to the larger narrative of the Bible as the story of God's redemption of God's people, it doesn't fit into the Bible. And so that's why it's not included. So it might be called a gospel, but if it's just a listing of sayings from Jesus, or if it's, silly little stories about how Jesus turned clay birds into real birds so that he could make them attack his friends because they were being mean to him, that doesn't fit into our idea that it's not just a biography, it's a biography for the purpose of pointing toward the meaning of the covenant. And if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't fit. It's not a real gospel. So I thought that was really helpful, a really helpful way to frame it. Any questions or comments about that before we move on to the next question?
One was John wrote his Bible how many years after the ascension?
John was the last gospel of the four. Mark is the earliest. His was around 70 CE. So that would have been about approximately 40 years after the events that are portrayed. And then Matthew and Luke are approximately 80 to 85. And then John is a little bit harder to pinpoint. Some people say as early as 90, others say as late as 130, which would be 100 years after the events. So none of them are immediately. All of the gospel books are newer or younger than the letters that we get later from Paul and the Peter letters and all of those.
Okay.
All right, so I wanted to just briefly mention, that we're asking this question about gospel inconsistencies. So why am I hung up on genre, and why am I spending so much time thinking and talking about that? And I want to, remind everyone, we've talked about this before, but why something was written is important for us to understand how we should read it. If I'm given a recipe and I understand that it is a recipe, I'm not going to read it as poetry necessarily. And if I try, it's going to seem like an awfully strange poem. This doesn't rhyme. It doesn't have any meter to it. What is this? But if I understand what the genre is of the recipe, then I'm going to know how to read it. I'm going to know how to set my mind around it. I'm going to have certain expectations of it that I will be looking for. First, it should give me the ingredients, and then it should tell me, how to put the ingredients together and the instructions step by step on how to make the dish. Whereas when I approach a poem, I'm not expecting those types of things. So why something was written is important. I think it's also important to remember that no genre is going to give us pure fact. Even books, even media of any kind that claims to be as objective as possible is going to be really difficult to really come by. as soon as we start engaging with something, we're already interpreting it in some way. We're comparing it to other experiences. We're judging whether it is good or bad. All kinds of things are happening there. And that's kind of part of what it means to be human. So I want to give you kind of two examples of what I'm talking about here, that I kind of ran into this week when I just was looking at different articles for other projects that I'm working on, or out of nowhere at all. I ran into this project this week, which I thought was really interesting. I graduated from Gettysburg College, and so I still get their newsletter, and I get emails from them every once in a while. And one of the things that they like to brag about, of course, is the study of the Battle of Gettysburg and the projects that their students and professors are working on. And so this is a screenshot from an online database where this group of scholars work together to think about not just where the lines of the Confederate and Union defenses and offenses were, but actually thinking about how the terrain itself may have changed the decisions that were being made by the people who were making them. So on this picture, I know it's really hard to see because it's kind of dark, but down there's an eyeball. There's a red eyeball, and it has an arrow pointing, and that is on the beginning, at the beginning of the third day of the battle, the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee stood there with his second in command, Longstreet, and he looked out across toward the enemy lines, and he decided whether he was going to attack or not. And historically, we all know that part of the tragedy of this battle, and something that I got to experience firsthand many times as I lived there and spent time there, was that when you stand along where those blue lines are and you look out across that field toward where the red lines are, you can see that there's actually a pretty steep grade in terms of the how you have to get up there, that you have to go uphill quite a bit. But when you stand on the other side, when you stand where the red lines are and you look toward where the blue lines are, the features of the land kind of hide that. It looks like it's pretty flat, even though it's not, even though it's a pretty steep grade. And so that's kind of number one. That's something that I've known about my entire life, and kind of part of my understanding of this historical event. But what this group of scholars did was they used a lot of different maps and their own various scientific methods to think about and look at what the terrain actually allowed Pickett or Lee and Longstreet to see when they were standing there. And so when you look on this picture here, you can see that there are parts that are gray and then there are parts that are white. The gray is actually showing the parts of the terrain that they could not see, whether because there was a mountain blocking it or it was down into a culvert of some kind, anything like that. They couldn't see those things because of the terrain and because of where they were standing. And so this is an example of how, historically, I've always thought, oh, well, I have a pretty good sense of, what happened, what factually, historically, accurately happened in this place, and thinking about, trying to be objective about why these things happened, and understanding that General Stewart, who was supposed to be running around with his horses trying to find information about where the Union soldiers were and get that information back to General Lee, and he wasn't around, he disappeared on him, and so that caused him all kinds of problems. All of these things that I learned, and now I'm learning that there is a whole other facet to this that nobody's really ever thought about until these people said, hey, this might affect some of this as well, and understanding why and how this tragedy could have happened, where all these thousands of people died. And so, you can't be totally objective when you're looking at history because you don't have all the information, and we continue to not have all the information about this or any historical event, even even historical events that we ourselves participate in. We have a particular perspective on it. One other example that I want to share with you is I learned something interesting this week. Um, so I don't know if you learned about this when you were in school, but one of the things that we learned every year when we talked about the colonialization of the Americas after America was, quote unquote, discovered by Columbus, and then the British started sending their colonizers to establish colonies in the New World. And one of the very first colonies was on Roanoke Island. And so they went there and they established themselves. And this was one of the only places that there were white women. They brought women with them to this colony. And then the leader of the expedition had to go back to England almost immediately after getting there with his family, because they needed more supplies. And by the time he got back, everyone was gone. And so the lesson, the story that we were told was that they saw this strange word that was scratched into the wall, the fence, the tree, that said Croatoan. And nobody really knew what this meant. It was referring to a local tribe, but the tribe didn't know anything about any of this. And so they just call this the lost colony. Everyone disappeared. Historically, it's a mystery. Nobody knows where these people went. Well, this article that I read this past week says, actually, we've always known where these people went. They went to the next island over, to Hatteras Island, and they established a new colony with the Croatoan Native Americans there. And they lived together, and they brought all of their materials that they could carry from the Roanoke colony so that they could use them. And now that they've started doing some archaeological digging, they've discovered Native American artifacts right next to artifacts that obviously came from England. They found slate, where people, and chalk where people would write things. They found rifle barrels that had been chopped off and used to collect sap from trees. All kinds of different things that were all mixed together. And so what actually happened to the Roanoke colony and members of the colony was not that they got killed or that they disappeared. It's that they integrated into the Native American culture and community, intermarried, had children, and kind of disappeared into history in that way. But it was not very convenient to tell that story to anybody because we wanted to invade this land. We wanted to establish economic and political control over this land. And so we had to make sure that we differentiated ourselves from the inhabitants of the land. We had to say, no, these are barbarians. These are not fully human. They're animals, so that we could justify killing and stealing and calling this place uninhabited and ready for someone to come and tame it. So because the truth was not very helpful or convenient, they just lied and said something completely different. And not to this day, I don't know if they still teach this anymore. It's been a couple of years since I was in school, but up until I was in school, they continued to teach that lie as history, as this is what happened. And so these are just two random examples of things that I came across this week that remind us that when we're thinking about genre, when we're thinking about biography, even if someone is attempting to share something with us that is factually accurate and objective, it can't be done. because there are so many different complicating factors involved. So there's that aspect of my assumptions that I bring to this. I'm doing a lot of assumptions to get us started. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I can get quickly past it. But I have one more thing that I want to say. This question was interesting to me because it was, how do I cope with this? And of course, coping indicates that, that there's something negative to be overcome in some way. How do I overcome this? How do I deal with this? And it's some kind of problem. And I don't remember who asked this question, and I don't know exactly in what context they were asking it, but I had to make some assumptions. And I assumed that part of the reason why the question was about coping was because of the issue of biblical inerrancy. Biblical inerrancy refers to the idea that the Bible is free from error. And different church groups, different individuals believe different things about this concept. But my question always, when somebody says that they believe that the Bible is inerrant, my question is always, what do you mean when you say inerrant? Because different people mean different things when they say this word. There are multiple different ways to interpret this. One of the ways that some groups interpret this is that they believe in transmission inerrancy. They believe that the Greek text that we have today, that we use to translate into English, our Bible, is a perfect copy of the original manuscript. We know that we don't have any original manuscripts of these things, but people who believe in transmission inerrancy believe that the Greek text that we have today, that we use, is a perfect copy of the original with no errors. Even if we find a new manuscript of the same book of the Bible, which happens all the time because it's very dry and very warm in this area of the world, and so papyri last a really long time, and you can find them, all the time in all the little caves all over the place. So we have a lot of different manuscripts of our New Testament books that are very old. But people who believe in transmission inerrancy believe that even if we find new manuscripts that are older, that disagree with the manuscripts that we have today, those are wrong. But the ones that we have are right in terms of being perfect copies of the original. And therefore, because those copies that we have are exactly what the original says, therefore, we have exactly what God intended to say to us in this version that we have today. So that's transmission inerrancy. But there are other kinds. Factual inerrancy, I think, tends to be the most common version that people ascribe to if they are people who say that they believe that the Bible is inerrant. People who believe in factual inerrancy believe that the Bible does not contain any errors, mistakes, or misinterpretations in terms of history and science. It lacks errors in all areas. Chronologically, it's perfect. Historically, it's perfect. Biologically, it's perfect. In terms of sociology, psychology, politics, physics, math, even art, everything is without error, mistake, or misinterpretation. Somehow, through the work of the Holy Spirit, the Bible is the only pure history that has ever been written. Which, there are many people who actually believe that. They feel very they feel very defensive of that idea, because without it, they feel that, if they can't trust the words that they're reading in the Bible, then how can they trust the Bible? And if they can't trust the Bible, then how can they trust God? And so their faith is really wrapped up in this, which I think is sad because I don't like people to have brittle faith. I don't like people to have faith that can be shaken by something as small as, this conversation that we're having tonight. But there are a lot of people out there who have that experience. And I think that might be, where this question about coping is coming from. If I believe that the Bible is inerrant, but then I see that there are inconsistencies in the Gospels, what do I do with that? How do I deal with that? And we'll actually talk about that in a minute. But I do have a couple more inerrancy things to say first. So a third type of inerrancy is theological inerrancy. The idea that the Bible maybe doesn't describe events as they factually happened. Maybe the Bible can make some assertions that don't line up with scientific fact. Maybe over the course of time, we as a society have learned new things about the way the world works, but those things don't matter, because what matters is the meaning behind the text. And the meaning behind the text, according to someone who ascribes to theological inerrancy, is without error. The meaning is perfect, even if some of the content is not. And so somebody who ascribes to this would say something like, the Bible is without error only when it comes to fulfilling its primary purpose, which is to reveal God, to reveal God's vision and purpose for the world, to reveal the good news that God has for us. Which, to some degree, I can get behind that idea, theological inerrancy, myself. But my question then is, if the meaning is without error, how do you figure out what the meaning is? Which, as we know from all of the different classes that we've done together, is not so easy to ferret out. And often, there's more than one meaning. I also wanted to just really briefly, before we jump into the actual question, address quickly inerrancy and infallibility, because infallibility is another word that gets thrown out there in this conversation. And so figured it would be a good time to address that. So some people say that inerrancy and infallibility are the same thing. They're synonyms that can be thrown around, used interchangeably. There's no difference between the two. But some groups disagree. They say that some groups say that inerrant means does not err. So the Bible does not have any errors. Infallible to some people means that the Bible cannot have errors. So that's a little bit, that's a little bit of a difference. Inerrant means the Bible does not have errors. Infallible means the Bible cannot have errors. By the very definition of scripture, of it being scripture, means that it cannot have errors. Not just that it doesn't, but that it can't, is what some people say. But then others say, no, that's not the relationship between these two words. Inerrancy, they say, refers to factual errors. So, the things that I described there under factual inerrancy, errors related to chronology, history, politics, science, things like that. Infallibility refers to theological truth. They say if inerrant means without errors, then infallible means without fail. The Bible will not fail those who are looking for God to be revealed. And again, I can kind of get behind that. God can be found in the Word. God is not contained in the scriptures, I don't believe, but God can be found there. And I believe that, the Bible will not fail us when we're looking for God. Not because it is itself special. The words themselves aren't special, but they, as Luther said, are the manger and swaddling clothes in which the Christ child is laid. So they contain the capital W word of God, Christ, and therefore they reveal God to us. I think that in here, with this idea about inerrancy being about factual errors and infallibility being about theological truth, this is where Luther would have fallen. He didn't use these kinds of words. There was no debate about inerrancy during his time, but he was once asked about a problem that they discovered. I mean, not really discovered it. Everybody always knew about it. But there's a place in Matthew where there is an error. It's a pretty obvious error that you can't very easily explain away. Matthew is citing a quote. He cites a lot of quotations from the Hebrew scriptures. And he says that the prophet Zechariah said this. But when you look back to find that quote in the Hebrew scriptures, it's actually from the book of Jeremiah. And so one time Luther was asked about this. They said, what do we do with this? The fact that our Bible contains this error. Matthew said that this was Zechariah, but it was clearly actually Jeremiah. And Luther said, such points do not bother me particularly. And the reason why they didn't bother him was because they don't change the core of the gospel message. He doesn't care if there are factual errors in the Bible, because what matters to him is the message, the theological truth, that the Bible is where we find God. And so, did Matthew make a mistake? Who cares? What matters to somebody like Luther and me is, what are we going to get out of it? So at this point, I want to say, whether we have to cope, quote unquote, cope with gospel inconsistencies, I think remains to be seen, because maybe we don't. But in the spirit of the question, I will talk to you about some ways of coping with gospel inconsistencies next. But before I do that, anybody have any questions or comments?
Nope.
All right, moving on. So, coping with gospel inconsistencies. I would like to make a deal and offer you doors number 1, 2, and 3 here. I think we have at least 3 doors. There may be more, but I came up with three doors, 3 options for how we might cope with gospel inconsistencies. So let's start with door number 1, shall we? So behind door number 1, we find the advice, ignore it. We can just ignore the problem. So I want to show you one example of inconsistencies in between 2 gospels and how we can ignore it if we want to. So here is these are 2 parts of the genealogies of Jesus. Matthew's genealogy starts with Abraham and talks about how Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, and blah, 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 and then finally gets to the end. And he says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, and the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. And then in the Gospel of Luke, Luke starts with Jesus and works his way backwards. And so he does somebody, the son of somebody, the son of somebody, the son of somebody. And so he starts this out with, Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, son of Heli. Now, these seem like they're, kind of mundane quotations, but you notice here that Matthew claims that the father of Joseph is named Jacob, and Luke claims that the father of Joseph was named Heli. So I guess Jesus didn't really get that close with his grandfather because he didn't even actually know his name, or somebody didn't know his name. Most of the time, nobody's really bothered by this. It doesn't matter. We can ignore it, right? This is not gonna, this is not earth shattering. This is not gonna shake anybody's faith to the core, to the point where they're going to leave Christianity and never look back. Now, of course, people who are already ambivalent or even malevolent toward Christianity might pick up something like this and use it as just another example of how this stuff is all bunk. but I don't think somebody who's reading, reading earnestly would, would fall victim to this. Ignore it. We can ignore it. But we have other options as well. So let's look at door number 2. Behind door number 2, we have explain it away. We can use some kind of logic to explain why something is not, in fact, a discrepancy or a difference. So again, 2 examples, bless you, of situations in 2 different gospels where there may be some kind of discrepancy. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus is sending his disciples, so they are now going to be apostles. He is sending them to share the news with of what's going on to others, and he gives them instructions. And in Mark's gospel, it says he ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. And then in Matthew chapter 10, same story, but this time it says, take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. So the problem here being mostly related to the staff, because Mark says, take nothing except a staff. But Matthew says, do not take gold or silver or any of these things or a staff. So are these guys allowed to bring their staff along with them or not? Is the question here. And again, not something that I lose sleep over at night personally, but people who are into this factual inerrancy thing are going to be really upset by this. They have to figure out, what's going on here so that they can stick with this. And we don't tend to, allow evidence that contradicts our deeply held beliefs to get in our way very easily. We tend to say, well, let's figure out how we can, manipulate this, how we can fit this in to our current scheme before we go off the deep end here and have to start all over and figure out all this stuff again. That's just human nature. But I have to tell you, I spent so much time wading through endless explanations for this stuff. This particular one had a 3-paragraph explanation for how these 2 passages are not a contradiction because the word in Greek that is translated in both of these passages as to take has an alternative translation of to acquire. And so this person makes this 3-paragraph argument that they were not allowed to take a staff, or they were allowed to take a staff according to Mark, but in Matthew they were not permitted to acquire, not take, but acquire a staff. And so they were allowed to bring their own staff along with them, but if they lost it or broke it or were offered another one, they were not allowed to take that. They were not allowed to acquire a new staff or an additional staff. This person spent 3 paragraphs talking about this. I cannot emphasize that enough. And my response to that is, okay, fine. If that's how you want to do this, then that's fine with me. You can make that argument. I have made arguments about biblical text based on the interpretation of one particular verb and, trying to figure out what that means and what it might mean in this particular context. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but is this the kind of thing that we're really supposed to be spending our time on? Is my question to that person. Do I really need to read 3 paragraphs about whether or not the disciples were allowed to bring a staff with them on their trip? Does that have any kind of bearing on my faith? Well, if I believe in factual inerrancy, it kind of does, because that can be the first little crack in, in the eggshell of my faith, right? It can sow those seeds of doubt. And now all of a sudden there's the possibility of more and more until that crack breaks wide open, and then my entire world is shattered. So I get that, I've been there in my life for sure, experiencing that and fighting against that. But to me, it just doesn't seem to be the best way to cope. If we're coping, let's stop coping and let's start, I don't know, what's a different word? Let's start celebrating. Let's start being enthusiastic about our engagement with scripture rather than coping with inconveniences in it. So let's go back and look behind door number 3. This is the one that I like. Embrace it and learn from it. We can be afraid of gospel inconsistencies. We can worry that they are going to break our faith apart, or we can have the kind of faith that allows us to be curious and humble about our engagement with scripture. And I think that it will allow us to learn something new. So here's my example from the two different gospels of what is a potential inconsistency that we might be able to embrace and learn from. So in Mark chapter 14, I'm going to read you this little bit, and I'm not going to tell you where this comes from, but I want you to tell me. I want you to tell me specifically what day of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, does this take place on? So Mark chapter 14. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So what day of the week does this take place on, based on what you know of Holy Week?
Friday.
No. What day of the week do we celebrate that Jesus had his Passover last meal?
Monday, Thursday.
Thursday, yes. So in Mark and also in Matthew and Luke, Jesus and his disciples are preparing for the Passover feast on Thursday. Now I'm going to read to you from John chapter 19. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." So what day of the week does this happen on? When is Jesus crucified?
Well, he's crucified on Friday, but
Friday.
this makes it sound like a lot of things happened on Thursday or maybe even Wednesday, the day before.
So yes, so Jesus was crucified on Friday,
Right.
and he had his last supper on Thursday. That's part of our tradition. That's pretty settled. We all know that he was in the tomb for 3 days, so he had to have died on Friday. But these two passages give us a problem, because they locate themselves not based on the day of the week, of course, because they didn't have such a thing at this point, but they locate themselves based on the Passover. They use different words, but we've got the day of unleavened bread and the day of preparation for the Passover. So these two passages are about things that took place on the same day, in terms of if we're looking at the Passover relationship. But the events in Mark are about the Last Supper, which takes place on Thursday, and the events happening here in John are about Jesus' trial and death, which happens on Friday.
That's right.
So what's happening here is Mark, and along with him, Matthew and Luke, which we call the synoptic gospels together, have a different timeline in terms of when Passover falls in the week than John does. So this is a little bit convoluted. And so you might just decide, you can take door number one here. I can ignore this. The details appear in different stories. They're really vague. We don't really understand anything about the day of preparation or Passover because we're not Jews. So do we really care about this? Probably not. We can probably just ignore it. If we do care about it, if we're really that concerned about it, we could also explain it away. I found a whole article online about how the word in John chapter 19, verses 14, that is translated for preparation for the Passover, is actually a genitive noun, which therefore should be translated of, preparation of the Passover. And so it's not referring to the Passover preparation, it's referring to the Sabbath preparation, which of course would make sense because on Friday during the day, you prepare for the Sabbath on Saturday. And it just says the preparation of the Passover because Passover happened to be happening at the same time. It was the season of Passover at that time. On and on and on. Again, this nitpicky stuff to try to explain this stuff away. That argument actually doesn't work really either, because there's another place in John that is very explicit about the fact that they are about to eat Passover right before Jesus dies. So in John, Jesus doesn't get to eat the Passover meal because he's already dead by the time it takes place. But in Mark and Matthew and Luke, he eats the Passover meal as his last supper the night before he dies. So what do we do with this? If we can't ignore it because it's bothering us and we can't explain it away, maybe we can embrace it. Maybe we can learn something from it. Maybe we can have some holy curiosity about this and open ourselves up to potential learning. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson on the Jewish calendar. So get ready for this one. So this chart is a chart that divides out the events of the last the 4 days before Jesus' resurrection. The top line has what we would understand to be days of the week. Wednesday night through Sunday in the daytime. But if you remember, or maybe you didn't even know this, Jews don't calculate their day from midnight to midnight or from morning to morning. They calculate it from sundown to sundown. And so I've divided the colors based on the day of the Jewish monthly calendar. So Nisan the 14th, Nisan the 15th, Nisan the 16th, and Nisan the 17th. Nisan is the day of the month, and those numbers 14, 15, 16, 17 are the date in the calendar. And you notice that, for example, 14 Nisan is Wednesday night into Thursday morning. And then when the sun goes down on Thursday, it's no longer 14 Nisan, it's 15 Nisan, because the Jews divide their days from sundown to sundown. So you can see here that on Thursday during the day, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples are preparing for the meal because it's the day of preparation. It's the day that the lambs are slaughtered, like it said in the passage. It's the day that you find your location where you're going to have your meal if you don't have a home to host it in. And then sundown comes, and now it's a new day. Now it's the day of Passover, which is the 15th of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. So now it's the 15th of Nisan. And so now we've spent all day on the 14th preparing. Now it's the 15th, and we're going to actually have the meal. We're going to celebrate the Passover, which Jesus does. He has his supper and he celebrates his Passover meal. So you see this connection here with the Last Supper and that Passover. So that is the connection that Matthew, Mark, and Luke want us to make. And then as night turns into day, Jesus, goes to the garden, he prays, he's arrested, he's tried, he's crucified, and he's buried. All of this happens all during the day on Friday, which is still the 15th of Nisan. So this is the Passover day itself. And then we get into the Sabbath. When the sun goes down on Friday evening, now it's the Sabbath day, from Friday night to Saturday night when sundown comes. So we get our Sabbath day, and then when Saturday night comes, the women prepare to visit the tomb and anoint the body of Jesus. And then on Sunday morning, when they go there, they discover that the tomb is empty. So this is the timeline that we get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But let's look at John's timeline. Things are different. John's timeline is everything is pushed forward by a day when we're looking at our days of the week. In John's gospel, the day of preparation is not on Thursday during the day, it's on Friday during the day. And we see evidence of this all throughout the Gospel of John in this section. The Jews, the bad guys, the leaders that want Jesus killed say, we've got to get this done quickly because we can't have this guy crucified on the Passover. It will lead to a riot. People will lose their minds because they all like this guy. We've got to get this taken care of right away as soon as possible, so that he's dead and gone before we get to the Passover. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on the day of Passover, Jesus is on the cross. He's died. But in John, they're trying to get this all finished before the Passover happens. According to that passage that we looked at, Jesus is being tried and crucified on the day of preparation, right? It said the day of preparation for the Passover. And so his timeline doesn't match Matthew, Mark, and Luke's. But just like up here, where we said, oops, where'd my cursor go? Where we said that the supper goes with the Passover meal, what lines up over here? Not the supper, but the trial, crucifixion, and the slaughter of the lambs. So what John is trying to do here is not change history. He's not trying to cause problems for us. He's not trying to confuse us. He's trying to make a theological point. He is focused on this idea that Jesus is the lamb. Jesus is slaughtered at the same time that the lambs are being slaughtered in preparation for the Passover. So historically, what's more likely? I would say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke is historically more likely. But what does John teach us by changing it and having the days of the week match up differently? He's telling us that Jesus is the Passover lamb. And theologically, we have to think about, what does that mean for us? So when we think about inconsistencies in the Gospels, we can ignore them, we can explain them away. But if we can stop and we can look and we can ask, why is this different? What is this? What are these two different authors trying to say with these differences that they've got here? Then I think we can learn something, because from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we learn, the covenant relationship, the meal, that experience of the people of God in Exodus is critical to their understanding of their relationship to God and who God is. And that Passover meal that they celebrate every year in and year out, is a reminder that covenantal relationship that they have with God. And so connecting Jesus' last meal with that Passover meal gives deep theological meaning to, to his life and to the events that are about to take place. But for John, what's more important isn't that covenantal connection. It's that lamb, that sacrificial lamb connection. He wants us to realize that Jesus is the Passover lamb that is being slaughtered at the same moment as the lambs that are used for the Passover meal. And so he changes the timeline so that Passover in his timeline coincides with the Sabbath. The Passover takes place on the Sabbath, which happens, it's just a different year. In the same way that we have Christmas on Sunday some years and other years we have it on Thursday, Passover happens on the Sabbath sometimes and sometimes not. So John moves his timeline around. If you are a factual inerrancy person, that's a huge problem for you. But if you can let go of that and you can say, the Bible isn't a source of chronological, factual, scientific information. The Bible is the place where God meets us and shares who God is. It's the place where we are reminded and taught about who God is and the covenant that God has made with us and the redemptive history that we are experiencing with God. Then we can learn a lot, because I think both of these timelines have something to say to us about the meaning of Jesus' life and death, if we can engage with them and engage with those differences. So any questions?
That's why I
that?
agree.
I know that was a lot of nitpicky stuff to try to help you understand that, but does everybody follow all of that? Any questions?
John and I were right.
John and you?
Yeah. Yeah, I picked Friday, remember?
You did, yes.
The J in our first names was the connection.
Yes, that must have been it. James and John, right? The famous brothers. Cindy, did you have something?
I was just going to say, I love the way you organize our lessons and how you give such attention to the details, because it's not anything that I've ever really thought about before, but it makes such sense.
Well, and this was just, one example. There are obviously lots of gospel inconsistencies, but I felt like this was a really good one because it's something that is, when you really read the story and try to understand what's going on, it's something that you can come across and say, hey, that's different. But it has such depth to the meaning. I thought about using another example of an inconsistency is how Judas died. But that doesn't have the meaniness to it in terms of theology that this one does, at least as far as I'm concerned. Maybe somebody can come up with some juicy meaning and something to chew on with that, but I wasn't feeling it this week. But this is just really, really meaningful to me when you line it up like this and you can see how Jesus is eating with his followers, and you think about what the Passover is and what the Passover means to the Jewish people. It's so meaningful. But then when you think about the idea that Jesus is being slaughtered at the same time that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lambs are being slaughtered, I mean, that is a visceral image that can really impact you if you think about it. But people who have this factual inerrancy thing, they don't get to enjoy that, and that's sad to me. I wish I could break them open. I wish I could help them to have the courage to go through the scary moments of kind of re-understanding and reorganizing so that they could have that. All right.
Very
So
good.
how can we cope with gospel inconsistencies? Well, I think first we have to decide how we're going to read the Bible. I think that this makes all the difference in the world. What is the Bible? What is the purpose of the Bible? How do I read the Bible? And we've talked about that a lot in this class, because I think that's the key to all of this. If you don't agree with me about how to read the Bible and what the Bible is for, then at least a little bit, then you're probably not still in this class, because that to me is the foundation of having having a meaningful faith. Not so much that we have to agree on what we read, but we have to agree that how we read is acceptable. And there are a lot of people out there who would be horrified by how I read and how I don't read. And I know that. But I really appreciate being able to be in this space where I can talk about how I read and not be afraid of that horrified response. I think we have to bring humility to the process. I think we have to bring our curiosity. I think we have to not be afraid of our questions and our natural desire to understand and know, but also realize that we don't know everything, and that things are never what they seem when it comes to what God's got going on. I love our little theme quote that I haven't brought up in our class for a long time, but our Saint Augustine, if you understand it, it's not God thing. That we always have something to learn. What could we learn? Why does this inconsistency exist? And what could I learn by examining it a little bit closer? And then this is not a quote that Lutherans would buy into, because they don't believe in perfect sanctification. This is more of a Methodist quote, but I kind of liked it for this class's purposes. God doesn't call perfect people. God perfects called people. Remembering, I think one of the best good newses that is in the good news is that God chooses to be in relationship with us, warts and all. That's true of us. And we know that because it's true of the Bible characters that we encounter in Scripture. None of these people are perfect. None of these people are people that we really want to always imitate. They all make really terrible mistakes and do terrible things because they're humans. And if that's true of the Bible characters, and that's true of us, then I think it can also be true of the people who passed down the stories, who wrote down the stories that now we find in our scriptures. And we don't have to be afraid of that, because we can trust that God is part of that process, and God is there and present and promises to be revealed, be available to us in that encounter with the scripture. So I couldn't decide which one of these Bible passages I wanted to leave you with, so I'm going to give you two today, and I think they kind of go hand in hand. So we've got first we've got 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 through 17. All scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. And then Romans chapter 15, verse 4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. So what is the Bible for? It is for equipping us for good works, so that we can be proficient in what God is calling us to do. It's also so that we might have hope. So when we think about gospel inconsistencies, when we think about, anything that we read in the Bible and the challenges that come with it, if we're asking, how is this going to equip me? How is this giving me hope? I feel like those two things are everything that we need when we're reading and when we're engaging and studying together or by ourselves. And if it's an inconsistency, if it's bothering you, if it's challenging you in some way, ask that question instead. Don't ask, how can I answer this? How can I respond to this? How can I, wish this away? Ask, how can this inconsistency teach me something? How can it equip me? How can it bring me hope in the situation that I'm in my life right now? And I think that's the best way to cope with it. So that's what I have for this week. Questions, comments, disagreements. I'm still waiting for the week when one of you is just gonna, rip into me with disagreements.
It was very good tonight.
Thank you.
Very good. I have to agree with Cindy. Do a great job.
All right. Well, next week's topic is the question, how might I apply what I learned in this class to my life? I think we've been at this for long enough now that I will have some things to say about that. So we'll talk about the application question. All right, friends. Anything else for the good of the order tonight?
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Cindy. Will you still be with us next week, Cindy, or will you be gone?
No, next week I'll be gone.
Okay. Well, you'll have to catch up later, or you'll just never know how to apply to your life.
I know. My goodness.
All right. Well, I will see you Sunday, so I won't say goodbye yet, but if I don't get to talk to you too much, I hope you have a wonderful time and safe travels. And tell Angela hi and that we miss her in class. It's been a long time. I know she's a busy lady.
It has been a long time. I wish she would rejoin us. But yep, I will tell her hi.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, all. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye-bye.